The cold air of the Monroe County Family Court clung to my skin like a warning. I sat motionless, my back pressed tightly against the unforgiving wooden bench as the second hand on the large courtroom clock ticked far too loudly. It was Monday, 8:45 a.m. I had been here since 7, unable to sit still at home, unable to breathe freely anywhere. My hands clenched into fists in my lap, nails biting into my palms as I stared at the man sitting 2 rows in front of me. Brandon Keller, my ex-husband, dressed immaculately in a navy suit, perfectly tailored to match the persona he wore like armor. Calm, polished, unshakable. The same man who once threatened to leave me on the side of the road in a snowstorm for talking back now smiled faintly at the judge as if we were all at a brunch meeting. My stomach churned. Sitting behind me was my 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, her tiny frame half buried in the folds of my mother Helen's coat. Sophie clutched her favorite stuffed penguin, Pepper, so tightly that the worn fabric looked ready to split. Her wide hazel eyes never left me. I wanted to turn around and tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't lie, not today. The judge, the Honorable Melanie Harmon, entered precisely at 8:50 a.m. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Harmon was tall, lean, with sharp gray eyes that missed nothing. She adjusted her reading glasses and shuffled the thick pile of papers before her. My name, Elise Morgan, and Brandon's were printed in bold at the top of the custody case file. My chest tightened painfully. Brandon's attorney, a tall man with slicked back hair named Richard Ames, stood first. His voice was soft yet calculated. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Keller, seeks full physical and legal custody of his daughter, Sophie Keller. He believes shared custody has proven detrimental to the child's emotional well-being. I stopped breathing. The words hit me harder than any blow ever could. Brandon Keller sat beside his lawyer, completely unbothered, adjusting his tie. He didn't even glance my way. I stared down at my trembling hands. I wanted to stand. I wanted to scream. I wanted to say that he was lying, but the words lodged somewhere deep inside my throat, immovable like a stone. Richard continued, citing erratic emotional instability and inability to provide a structured home environment as grounds for removing me from Sophie's life. My pulse roared in my ears. Each sentence felt like another nail in the coffin Brandon had spent years building for me. Brick by brick, lie by lie. Judge Harmon finally looked up. Her gaze locked onto me. Ms. Morgan, do you have a response at this time? My lips parted, nothing. The courtroom became heavier, suffocating. I stared helplessly at Sophie. Her legs swung nervously off the bench, her small face full of quiet fear, and something else. Something steady. The clock on the wall ticked. I lowered my gaze and exhaled shakily. I was losing my daughter, and I could not stop it. Then, from the back of the room, a tiny voice sliced through the oppressive silence. Clear, steady, braver than I had ever heard it. Your Honor, I brought a video from Daddy's phone. I think you should see it. Everything froze. 3 months earlier, life had been simpler if not easy. Our little duplex on Monroe Avenue in Brighton, Rochester creaked with the soft noises of an old home. The pipes groaned at odd hours, the floorboards sang under late-night footsteps, and the radiator hissed like an impatient old cat. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Sophie called it the nest. She insisted the soft pink curtains in her room made it feel like the inside of a cotton candy cloud. Every night, I read her 2 stories instead of 1, even when I was bone-tired from work. We curled up together under her quilt, covered in tiny suns and stars, while her loyal companion, Pepper the penguin, sat at the foot of the bed like a silent guardian. I worked from the cramped dining table turned home office as a freelance copywriter. It barely paid the bills, but it let me stay close to Sophie. We made it work. Macaroni and cheese nights, weekend puzzles, sidewalk chalk drawings that stained the driveway until the rain washed them away. Sophie's laughter echoed in every room. That sound was my oxygen. My mother, Helen Morgan, lived just 2 blocks away. She never knocked. She arrived with lasagna or chicken soup, scrubbed my bathroom when I wasn't looking, folded laundry I swore I didn't need help with. I used to protest. Now I just whispered "thank you" against her shoulder when words failed me. "You're doing better than you think, Elise," she would say. "You're not just surviving. You're showing her how to survive, too." I believed her, most days. One of the things that kept us grounded was something I'd created during the worst days of the divorce, the truth jar. A simple mason jar on the kitchen counter where Sophie could write any question or fear and fold it inside. We would pull out one note together each night before bed. Sometimes the questions were silly. Why do cats hate baths? Other nights they gutted me. Will Daddy stop loving me if I live with you? I had promised Sophie the truth, always, no matter how much it hurt me to say it out loud. I told her love wasn't something that disappeared based on addresses or holidays or signatures on a court document. I thought that was enough. I thought I was protecting her by shielding her from the ugliest parts of what Brandon had become. I had no idea that Sophie had been quietly collecting her own truths. The cracks in the foundation of our little nest were already forming, even if I couldn't see them yet. It started slowly, the way winter creeps into Rochester. Not with a single storm, but with a cold that settles into your bones before you realize the season has changed. About 6 weeks before that Monday in court, the signs became impossible to ignore. Sophie came home from Brandon's house quieter, withdrawn. The sparkle in her hazel eyes dimmed just a little more each Sunday evening. She wouldn't tell me why. Not at first. She only clung to Pepper tighter at bedtime, asking for the lights to stay on a little longer. Brandon had always been controlling, even back when we were married. What I mistook for protectiveness had been something far darker, a need to dominate every choice, every detail. Now he micromanaged from afar, disguised as concern. He criticized what I packed in Sophie's school lunches. He texted me demanding to know why I picked her up 2 minutes late. He insisted on reviewing her homework even on weeks she was in my care. I saved everything: emails, text messages, voicemails. A private folder on my computer held screenshots of the cruel words he hurled at me behind closed doors. Words no child should hear her father say about her mother. Words I never shared with Sophie because I thought sparing her the truth was protecting her. Until the night she found me crying silently at the kitchen sink. I hadn't meant to let the tears fall. I stared at the half-washed dishes, chest tight, the weight of it all unbearable. Without a word, Sophie tiptoed into the room, her soft pajama feet whispering against the linoleum. She draped her small blanket around my shoulders and stood next to me, just stood there. I couldn't stop shaking. I couldn't even speak. Later that night, she asked her first hard question. I was tucking her in when her voice came out so softly I almost missed it. "Mom, do you ever get scared around Daddy?" My breath caught painfully. I sat frozen at the edge of her bed. Sophie stared down at her cereal print pajamas, tracing the stitching absent-mindedly. "I do," she whispered, "but I don't think I'm supposed to say that." The air in the room became unbearable. I reached for her tiny hand and held it tightly in both of mine. I wanted to tell her no, that she had nothing to be afraid of, but I couldn't lie. I squeezed her hand instead and said what I knew was true. "You're always allowed to say what you feel here. You're always safe with me." That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the shadow of the ceiling fan slicing across the walls like a silent metronome counting down time I didn't have. I had been so desperate to avoid war that I hadn't realized silence was letting him win. 2 weeks later, the paperwork arrived. I opened the thick manila envelope with trembling fingers at 2:17 p.m. on a rainy Thursday. I sat on the living room carpet because my knees buckled reading the first line: "Petition for full legal and physical custody of Sophie Keller." Accusations filled page after page. Brandon's lawyer alleged I was emotionally unstable, unreliable, mentally unfit to co-parent. They painted me as a woman unraveling, a danger to my child. I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to steady my heartbeat. The walls of the living room closed in around me. I called my mom. I didn't even get out full sentences before Helen was at my door with a thermos of chamomile tea and that silky scarf she only wore to church or funerals. She sat on the carpet beside me, held my wrist tightly. "You have the truth," she whispered. "That's enough." I wanted to believe her. I wanted so badly to believe it would be enough. The days blurred after the papers arrived. I went through motions I barely remembered, brushing Sophie's hair, making grilled cheese sandwiches, answering work emails I couldn't focus on. I smiled when I had to, but inside I was unraveling thread by thread. 2 weeks before the hearing, the official court summons came. Brandon Keller versus Elise Morgan. Family Court, Monroe County Courthouse. Monday, 9 a.m. The words stared back at me from the stark, white paper like they had teeth. I sat at the kitchen table in our tiny duplex in Brighton with the paper trembling in my hand. Sophie colored quietly at the other end of the table, oblivious for now, filling in a drawing of trees and houses with the same careful attention she always gave her art. But I could feel the clock ticking in my head. I called my lawyer, David Abrams, the next morning. He was calm, methodical, clinical even. I wasn't looking for warmth. I just needed someone who believed me. "Document everything, Elise," David said. "Every text, every phone call. Keep your emotions in check at the hearing. Don't interrupt. Don't argue. Let the evidence speak." But what evidence? Emails and texts wouldn't show the years I spent swallowing my pride for the sake of keeping the peace. Screenshots wouldn't capture the subtle, relentless erosion of my confidence, the fear of answering a phone call, the dread of an unexpected knock at the door. I spent the next 10 days gathering what little proof I had. Messages where Brandon cursed at me for being late by 4 minutes. Screenshots of him threatening to report me to Child Protective Services for taking Sophie to a pediatrician without his approval. I knew it wouldn't be enough. I had seen how Brandon charmed strangers. In public, he was the golden boy, the funny, dependable realtor who remembered every client's birthday, sent holiday cards, and donated to charity events. In private, his voice could turn to steel in seconds over a misplaced charger or spilled juice. I kept Sophie out of it. I never showed her the emails or the voicemails. I thought I was protecting her. I had no idea she had already begun to protect me. The night before court, I couldn't sleep. I sat beside Sophie's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall steadily as she slept, clutching Pepper tightly. I whispered a silent promise to the darkness. "I will not let him take you." My mom came early Monday morning. She wore the silky church scarf again and gripped my hand tightly before we left. "You've already survived more than most," Helen said. "You can survive this too." Sophie wore a soft blue dress with tiny yellow sunflowers and packed her school tablet in her little pink backpack as if it was just any other day, but I saw the worry in her eyes. She didn't speak on the car ride. She stared out the window, quietly humming an unfamiliar tune. As we approached the courthouse, the imposing stone building seemed to loom taller than I remembered. Brandon was already there waiting, standing tall and confident near the entrance with his lawyer at his side. He waved casually as we walked up the courthouse steps, flashing that practiced smile that had fooled so many for so long. Sophie didn't wave back. The doors to the courthouse closed behind us with a heavy, echoing thud. The fight of my life was about to begin. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and varnished wood. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as I sat frozen in my chair. 9 a.m. sharp. Judge Harmon looked up from the thick case file and motioned for Brandon's attorney to proceed. Richard Ames rose smoothly, buttoning his dark, tailored suit, and smiled faintly as if this was just another polite negotiation. His voice was calm, deliberate, almost gentle, but every word was a dagger aimed directly at me. Your Honor, he began, my client, Mr. Brandon Keller, has demonstrated himself to be a responsible, stable, and dedicated father. He holds steady employment as a licensed real estate professional in Monroe County, owns his home, and has continuously prioritized the safety and well-being of his daughter, Sophie Keller. Brandon sat beside him, legs crossed, looking every inch the composed, successful father. Not a hair out of place, not a trace of the man I knew behind closed doors. As opposed to Ms. Elise Morgan, Richard continued, barely glancing in my direction, who has exhibited erratic behavior, financial instability, and emotional unpredictability that could place the child at risk. My breath caught painfully. I sat rigid, unable to even blink. Richard pulled out printed pages. We have submitted text exchanges as evidence. Exhibit A shows Ms. Morgan texting my client. I can't do this anymore. I'm exhausted. I'm falling apart. The words hung heavily in the air. The room felt smaller, somehow tighter. I remembered that night. I had sent that message to Brandon at 2 a.m. after 4 days straight of working, caring for Sophie with a fever, and breaking down quietly in the laundry room where Sophie couldn't hear me. Richard's voice interrupted my spiraling thoughts. Exhibit B. Please stop yelling at me around Sophie. Again, Your Honor. More evidence of her instability and poor judgment trying to dictate Mr. Keller's parenting techniques. I clenched the sides of my chair as heat surged behind my eyes. They had turned my desperate attempts to protect my child into accusations of manipulation. Brandon stood slowly as Judge Harmon nodded for him to speak. His expression was perfect, pained but controlled. His voice smooth and earnest. I'm not trying to take Sophie away out of anger, Brandon said. I'm here because I believe shared custody is no longer in Sophie's best interest. MS. Morgan confuses her. She makes our daughter afraid of me. I just want to protect her. Protect? The word hit me like a slap. Judge Harmon turned to me. Ms. Morgan, do you have a response? My mouth opened. Nothing came out. My heartbeat thundered inside my chest. I tried to speak, tried to defend myself, tried to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. My tongue felt heavy, my lungs constricted. I glanced behind me. Sophie sat next to my mom on the bench, her legs too short to reach the floor, swinging back and forth nervously. She gave me a look I would never forget, a mixture of worry and fierce determination. My attorney stood awkwardly, clearing his throat, offering a weak response about the natural overwhelm of single parenting. It barely scratched the surface of what was happening. No one spoke of the phone calls where Brandon screamed at me in front of Sophie. No one mentioned the nights Sophie wet the bed after returning from her weekends at her father's house. None of it existed in the cold, polished version Brandon had presented. Judge Harmon scribbled notes, expression unreadable. My hands trembled violently under the table. Brandon stood again. Your Honor, I request full physical and legal custody of Sophie Keller, effective immediately. I believe Ms. Morgan is emotionally harming our daughter. The walls felt like they were closing in, the ceiling too low, the air too thin. I locked eyes with Sophie. I had no idea how I was supposed to protect her from what was unfolding right in front of her. That's when Sophie gently slipped her hand from my mother's grasp, stood up quietly, and walked toward the front of the courtroom with a calmness that took my breath away. She clutched her school tablet tightly in both hands and looked straight at the judge. Your Honor, Sophie said, her voice clear and unshaken. I brought a video from Daddy's phone. I think you should see it. The entire courtroom fell completely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the sound of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to vanish. Brandon's confident expression faltered. His lawyer stiffened, quickly whispering something urgent. Judge Harmon looked genuinely surprised for the first time that morning. Sophie stood there in her sunflower dress, her shoulders small but square, her grip tight around the tablet. She raised it slightly higher, her voice soft but certain. "It's from last weekend," she said. "Daddy didn't know I was awake, but I was. I heard him yelling, and I thought maybe if someone heard it, they would believe me and Mommy." I felt my chest crack open. My sweet, brave child had done what I never could. Judge Harmon gestured to the bailiff. "Bring it here." Sophie walked forward slowly, passing the long wooden benches and the man trying to take her away from me. She handed the pink-cased tablet to the bailiff with shaking but determined hands. The bailiff brought it to Judge Harmon. The judge adjusted the screen, tapped the play button, and turned the volume up slightly. At first, only ambient noise filled the courtroom. The soft hum of nighttime air, distant car tires against wet pavement. Then his voice, Brandon's unmistakable voice, exploded through the courtroom. Sharp, cold, and vicious. "You think you're so smart, huh? Go ahead, try telling anyone. See what happens. You'll end up living in some foster home. And don't think your precious mother can save you. She's pathetic." I heard a chair scrape, a plate clatter. Sophie's small, frightened voice followed, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry." Brandon cut her off immediately. "Don't talk back. You're lucky I even let you come over. If you say a word to her, I swear." The judge hit pause. The frozen image on the screen was still, but the room vibrated with unspoken horror. Brandon sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the vein pulsing in his neck. His lawyer leaned in close, whispering frantically. Brandon ignored him. Judge Harmon stared at the tablet for a long moment before she slowly looked up. Her voice, calm and even, cut through the dense silence like a blade. "Where did this come from?" Sophie answered without hesitation. "Daddy left his phone on the couch. I heard him yelling. I wanted to record it. I was scared, but I thought if someone heard it, they'd believe me and Mommy." My throat tightened painfully. My brave little girl had been scared, but she had made a plan. She had acted with more courage than most adults I knew. All I wanted was to run to her, scoop her up into my arms, tell her she never should have had to do any of this. But I stayed in my seat frozen because this moment belonged to her. Brandon's voice suddenly rose, strained, defensive. "Your Honor!" That recording was taken completely out of context. I was disciplining her. She was misbehaving. "Enough!" Judge Harmon interrupted, her tone sharp, final. The word cracked across the courtroom like a whip. Brandon fell silent instantly. The judge looked at Sophie and softened. "Thank you for being brave," she said. "You can go back to your seat now." Sophie nodded and walked back, her steps a little slower now as the weight of what she had done settled onto her small shoulders. Helen reached out, pulled her into her lap, and held her tightly. Judge Harmon shifted her gaze back to me. "Ms. Morgan," she said firmly, "do you have anything else to add?" This time, my voice came without effort. "No, Your Honor," I said, steady and certain for the first time that day. "I think my daughter said it all." The judge nodded once, leaned back in her chair, and quietly closed her eyes for a long, thoughtful pause. When she opened them again, her entire posture had shifted. She was no longer deliberating. She was deciding. "In light of this evidence," she announced slowly, "I am calling for an immediate review of all custody arrangements. Until that process is completed, full temporary custody will be granted to Ms. Morgan. Mr. Keller will have only supervised visitation rights." She turned her gaze toward the bailiff. "Please escort Mr. Keller from the courtroom until further notice." Brandon bolted up, stunned. "You can't be serious!" He shouted. "Sir," the bailiff warned, stepping forward. Brandon's lawyer scrambled to collect papers as Brandon glared furiously around the courtroom. He opened his mouth as if to argue again, but something in the judge's unwavering stare stopped him cold. He spun sharply and stormed out of the room with his lawyer trailing behind him. The heavy door closed behind them with a solid final thunk. The courtroom slowly emptied, but I remained seated. My legs felt weak. My hands shook violently in my lap. Sophie rested her head against my mother's shoulder, her small frame finally relaxing as the crushing tension began to lift. For the first time in months, I could breathe again. I sat frozen, staring at the polished wood grain of the table in front of me. My hands still shook, the adrenaline refusing to leave my body. The heavy door that Brandon had stormed through moments earlier felt like it had sealed shut an entire chapter of my life. The judge gathered her files and left the bench without another word. Yet when she glanced back toward Sophie, there was something different in her expression. Not pity, not surprise, respect. I stared at Sophie, still curled tightly in my mother's lap, her tablet resting dark and silent beside her on the bench. Helen rocked her slowly, her soft murmurs barely audible over the distant hum of courthouse traffic below. I stood on unsteady legs and crossed the worn carpet to them. Kneeling down in front of Sophie, I gently cupped her small hands in mine. "You were so brave," I whispered. She nodded slowly, the exhaustion of the moment finally beginning to show. Her shoulders drooped, and the strength that had carried her through that terrifying courtroom started to ebb away. But there was no fear left in her eyes. I could feel it too. The unbearable weight that had pressed down on my chest for so long had finally lifted, just enough to allow a full breath. I looked around as people trickled out of the courtroom. A few glanced at us sympathetically. One older woman mouthed the word brave as she passed. I took Sophie's hand again. "Do you want to come with me?" I asked softly. She slid from Helen's lap and nodded, slipping her tiny fingers into mine as naturally as she had since the day she learned to walk. We stepped out into the corridor, the noise of other courtrooms and distant chatter feeling strangely muted. We walked down the long marble steps of the Monroe County Family Court together, step by step, hand in hand. Outside, the gray Rochester sky hung heavy over the city. The wind nipped at Sophie's dress and whipped loose strands of my hair into my face. I didn't care. I stopped at the bottom of the steps and crouched down to Sophie's height, brushing her hair behind her ears. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. She stared at the concrete sidewalk for a long time, then finally shrugged. I didn't want to do it, but I had to. I felt my throat tighten again. I squeezed her hand gently. "I know," I said. "I'm so proud of you. You shouldn't have had to carry that alone." She blinked back tears, but stood straighter, the resolve still flickering behind those hazel eyes. "I didn't know if they would believe me," she whispered. I brushed my thumb across the back of her small hand. "They did, because you told the truth, because you were strong enough to speak up when no one else could." Her eyes met mine, bright with unspoken emotion. "Does this mean I don't have to go back to Daddy's house anymore?" The question hit me like a punch to the chest. I pulled her into my arms and held her tightly, pressing my lips against her soft hair. "You're safe," I whispered fiercely. "That's what matters. You are safe." The bailiff had given us a few more instructions before we left. A temporary supervision schedule for Brandon, court-appointed counseling evaluations before any further access would even be considered. I knew the fight wasn't completely over, but the worst part was behind us. The hardest moment, the unbearable silence of being unheard, was over. That afternoon we didn't go home. I couldn't bear the stillness of the duplex, the echoes of what had almost been taken from us. Instead, we went straight to my mother's house. Helen had already unlocked the door by the time we arrived. The familiar scent of chicken soup drifted from the kitchen. "It's warm out." I laughed softly as I set Sophie's backpack down. Helen waved a hand, already stirring the pot. "I make soup on emotional days. It gives me something to stir when everything else feels out of control." Sophie sat at the kitchen table, drawing silently with a box of crayons while I filled out more legal forms on the couch. At one point, she wandered over and slipped a folded piece of paper into my lap. I opened it carefully. It was a drawing of two hands holding a heart, bold red letters scribbled beneath. "Truth is brave." I stared at it, unable to stop the tears from falling silently down my cheeks. Not the quiet, hidden kind of truth I had spent years thinking was enough, but the loud, undeniable truth that finally freed both of us. Sophie said nothing. She just climbed onto the couch and leaned against my arm, her small head resting heavily on my shoulder. The sun began to dip below the horizon outside the window, and for the first time in years, I let myself believe that tomorrow might not feel so heavy anymore. For weeks later, I stood outside the same courthouse that had once felt like a prison. The heavy limestone walls no longer loomed over me like they used to. This time, my steps were steady as I walked up those same worn stone steps with my attorney at my side and Sophie's small hand tucked firmly into mine. The air was crisp, autumn leaves swirling around our feet as Rochester eased into early fall. The weight in my chest was still there, but lighter, manageable, something I could finally carry. The court-appointed counselor's report had arrived the week prior. I sat frozen at my kitchen table the moment I read the opening line. Subject displays controlling behavior, emotional instability, and a concerning lack of empathy for the well-being of the minor child. Brandon had denied everything. He had worn his best suit again, rehearsed his polished lies, but the video had spoken louder than any of his empty words ever could. That night in court was a wound he couldn't charm his way out of. As we stepped into the same courtroom, Sophie squeezed my hand tightly. I smiled down at her reassuringly. She didn't need to speak this time. She had already done more than enough. Judge Harmon entered at exactly 9 a.m. as before, her expression unreadable. The hearing was brief, clinical, but to me, every second stretched like hours. I held my breath as she read from her final decision. Based on the evidence presented, the counselor's report, and in consideration of the best interest of the minor child, full physical and legal custody of Sophie Morgan is hereby awarded to Ms. Elise Morgan. The respondent, Mr. Brandon Keller, is to have strictly supervised visitation no more than twice a month at a neutral visitation center under the supervision of trained professionals. No overnight stays are permitted until further order of this court. My entire body sagged, relief rushing through me so fast I had to grip the bench for support. I blinked hard, swallowing the emotion that threatened to overtake me. Brandon didn't speak. He didn't even look at me. His face was carved from stone as he collected his papers and left the courtroom without a word, his attorney scrambling behind him. The moment the door shut behind them, I exhaled fully for what felt like the first time in years. Helen stepped forward and hugged both me and Sophie tightly, her voice soft but fierce against my ear. "You did it." I shook my head slowly. "No," I whispered, glancing down at Sophie. "She did." Later that evening, we went to Sophie's favorite diner, the one with the red booths and the animal-shaped pancakes. She sat across from me, poking absent-mindedly at her food with her fork. "Is it over now?" she asked quietly. I reached across the table and gently covered her hand with mine. "It's safer now," I answered honestly. "We're not done growing through this. There will still be hard days, but we're not afraid anymore." Sophie nodded solemnly and then gave me the tiniest, most knowing smile. She twirled her straw in her chocolate milk. "I'm glad I told," she whispered. "So am I whispered back. I still replay that courtroom moment over and over sometimes. Brandon's mask shattering when Sophie stood. The unwavering strength in her small voice. She had reminded me that real power doesn't come from shouting or winning arguments. It comes from standing up for the truth. Even when you're terrified, no one will believe you. In the weeks that followed, I returned to therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I finally had the space to heal from what I had survived. I realized I had spent so long bracing for the next attack that I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without flinching. That would take time, but now I had the time. Sophie's drawings started to change too. Her sketches of dark skies and closed houses slowly gave way to trees with deep roots, kids holding hands under open skies and bright, vibrant sunflowers. One afternoon, she taped a drawing of a mason jar onto her bedroom wall. "It was our truth jar," She had drawn it large, with bold letters. Truth is brave. Every night, before bed, she reminds me to check it. The other night, I pulled out a note that read, "Do brave people still get scared?" I smiled, tucked the note into my palm, and said, "Yes, sweetheart. They just don't let fear be the end of the story." A few days later, I pulled out another folded paper. This one simply asked, "Can kids protect grown-ups too?" I looked at Sophie and smiled warmly. "You did. I tell this story now because I know somewhere out there is another woman sitting in silence, wondering if the truth will ever be enough, wondering if anyone will believe her over the polished lies of a man who performs the perfect version of himself in public. I want her to know sometimes the truth doesn't come from a lawyer, a courtroom, or a file folder full of evidence. Sometimes it comes from the smallest voice in the room, a child who has seen too much and who decides silence is no longer an option. I used to think being a good mother meant shielding Sophie from anything hard or painful. Now I know it means standing beside her as she faces it, teaching her to speak truth even when her voice shakes. We still have hard days, but we are no longer defined by them. We are not the scared versions of ourselves Brandon tried to keep trapped. We are loud when we want to be, quiet when we choose to be, and above all, we are free.